Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And I'd like to welcome you here to the beautiful auditorium at the Philosophical Research Society. My name is Dennis Bartok. I'm the Executive Director for PRS, and we are very excited to have one of our favorite lecturers, presenters here with us this evening, Devon Deimler, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment, for her presentation in Hybrid Moments, Myths of Crisis, Metamorphosis, and Aesthetic Survival. I would like to thank those of you that are joining us online via Zoom as well. I have to ask, is this the first time at PRS for anyone here tonight? You raise your hand. Well, welcome to PRS. It has been here since the mid-1930s. It's a 501c3 nonprofit cultural and educational organizations, and we present a very wide range of programs on the arts, on mythology, mysticism, a whole wide range of creative and esoteric subjects. We have some great events upcoming this week. Tomorrow night, in fact, we're doing a free event here. David Ray, who is a numismatist, he's an expert in coins, is presenting on ancient astrological symbolism in early coins, and he has an unbelievable collection of rare and beautiful coins that he will be here tomorrow night demonstrating and talking about. Thursday night, we're actually sold out. It's our big Krampus night, so if you have tickets, it's going to be amazing. If you didn't get tickets, unfortunately, it is sold out. But Friday, January 13th, we are doing a special, actually Friday the 13th, screening here of a rarely shown movie called Simon, King of the Witches. We're doing a number of screenings in January next month. On the 20th, we're doing a Gamera double feature featuring the legendary flying turtle from Japanese cinema, and Steve Reifel, who is an expert in kaiju films, Japanese kaiju movies, is going to be here to talk about the Gamera series and the differences with the Godzilla films. January 21st, we are kicking off monthly architectural tours here at PRS. So if you're interested in learning more about the history, the construction, what was here before PRS was built, and some of kind of the hidden nooks and crannies at PRS, you can sign up for that. This first one is actually a free event, but it is limited to 25 people. So I encourage you to sign up early. And then January 27th, we're going to have a cryptozoological night here, and we're going to be screening the pseudo-documentary, The Legend of Bigfoot, from the mid-1970s here on the screen at PRS. My final pitch before I introduce Devin is that we are in the middle of a roof restoration campaign for PRS. The roof here, as you can see from some of the missing tiles here and over there, over the library, over the book warehouse, and the bookstore is in desperate need of renovation and repair. Over the library and the lecture room, it dates back to the mid-1930s. Here, it's the late 1950s. We have some wonderful benefits if you donate to the campaign, which is on our website, online, including we have done new prints of some previously unpublished John Augustus Knapp illustrations from the late 1920s and early 1930s. This is the first time that they have ever been available. He was the illustrator for The Secret Teachings of All Ages and the Knapp Hall Tarot deck that we have just reprinted and will be available soon. So if you donate at a certain level, I think it's the $250 level or above, you will get a bundle of 5 previously unpublished, unavailable J.A. Knapp illustrations from the late 1920s, and they are gorgeous. We have the originals here in our archive, but this is the very first time that they have ever been printed and available to the public. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Devon Deimler. She is a writer, artist, and scholar. She is adjunct faculty at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where she earned her PhD in mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology. Her doctoral dissertation, Ultraviolet Concrete, Dionysius and the Ecstatic Play of Aesthetic Experience, won the Institute's Dissertation of Excellence Award. She holds a BA in Interdisciplinary Sculpture from the Maryland Institute College of Art, where she focused on event-based work and modern through contemporary art and film history. Devin's experience in the arts includes founding an independent record label and collaborative event project, Wildfire Productions, and working as assistant to the director at the Dennis Hopper Art Trust. She is curator of exhibits and events at Opus Archives and Research Center, home to the collections of James Hillman, Joseph Campbell, and Marija Gimbutas, did I say that correctly, among others, and is contributing scholar, formerly scholar in residence, right here at PRS, and we are very, very fortunate to have her contributing. She is the editor of 3 volumes of Manly P. Hall's signature edition series. Will you please join me in welcoming Devon Deimler?
Thank you, Dennis, very much. Let me get my first slide going for my first thank yous. Thank you, everyone, for being here, everyone that came out and braved, the bitter LA winter. That's a big deal, I know. And also thank you to everyone on Zoom. Some of my best friends are on Zoom tonight, and I greatly appreciate the presence, both physical and in the ether. I want to thank the amazing team at PRS, most of all Dennis, Kelly, Amanda, Liz, who's been doing graphic design, beautiful graphic design, the AV bookstore teams, and the volunteers. Dennis covered so much about what's been going on here. He has really generated an incredible range of events, and yeah, the Nap Tarot deck coming out, it looks beautiful. So please, if you have the means, help keep this roof over this place that's a real home for so many for so long. Okay, and RIP today, not David Lynch. I just scared a former student by saying he died yesterday. But Angelo Badalamenti passed away yesterday, as many of you may know. And I just wanted to acknowledge that, since it's such an important part of the presentation this evening, his music, and because music really, I think more than any other aesthetic type of experience, has that instantly transformative power. It can join with visual images. It really gets us in our kind of vital organs. And he was just a master and a gift of that. Okay, so this is a pretty precious, pretty new, in many ways, totally archaic in others, presentation for me, but it's something that feels important beyond my personal interests, because what these past few apocalyptic years have taught me about being a mythologist is that the stakes and standards of doing so, of interpreting myth, have changed or become more highly charged. To interpret myth is really not just a humanities discipline. It feels like it's a humanitarian practice of some sort. So I'm trying to take that on more, that spirit. And humanitarian's really not sufficient, since our myths and how we live them out affect so many other species as well. So I think that it is important to seek to become as conscious as we can of the myths that we're perpetuating, and also the myths that might need more protection, from more active protection on our end. So my purpose in engaging myth tonight is really hybrid. It's poetic, but it also is political on some level, and I think we really do need both to survive. And what I intend to do above all is to give voice to something that's usually unvoiceable, and hopefully to create a meaningful contribution to the subject that we'll be exploring. Here is a preview of where we're headed in the next hour, give or take. Past and present punks will recognize the source of my title. Is the first part of it is the Misfits song, Hybrid Moments. And this is really my mood setter. I like to come up with my and this one felt very fitting to me. So if you know it, feel free to play it in the back of your mind or just keep that battlemente inner radio going. But yeah, I feel like this song really carries a sense, a swooniness, a darkness, but a sort of invitation to kind of say, you know, fuck you to the things that you need to say that to. And we all need that. So I'll be talking about a lot of different but kindred Greco-Roman myths, which are the myths I know best. There are others that could speak to this subject as well. And I hope what that combination will do for you what it does for me, which is to create a sort of tapestry, a more nuanced picture of mythic metamorphosis in states and stages of crisis, in which aesthetic transformations, meaning changing form, appearance, correspond to inner emotional changes. All myths and stories are about change in some way. That's really not interesting to say in itself. What I'm talking about specifically here are bodies changing into other bodies, particularly female and childbearing bodies, especially when change is forced or willed, especially as this occurs in instances of sexual violence. So that does tell you already that some troubling material will be dealt with, and I just want to acknowledge that up front. I'll be using the word rape a lot more than I ever have in a given instance, and I just want to you know, let you be prepared that that's happening. I won't sort of make it harder than it needs to be, but it needs to be spoken. And the thing is that you really don't get involved in mythology without encountering monsters. You just don't. So some willingness to go there when you safely can is sort of what it's all about. But in this, don't know how to use this. Okay. In this spirit, I really do want everyone to feel safe and contained and ready. So if you don't mind, I'd like to have us all take a moment to sort of somatically ground ourselves together in this room, and the Zoom people, this applies to you too. You're in this community as well. So if you're comfortable, just close your eyes. Take some gentle but deep breaths. Just sense yourself relaxing a bit. And let yourself just touch a sense of groundedness, whether that's through your feet on the floor or your back against the chair. Picture just how much earth is beneath you, supporting you, and the presence of the people around you are supporting you too. Maybe people you came here with tonight, and if you're close friends or partners, and you want to squeeze a hand right now, you could do that. So just feel that kind of more eternal body of time that's always there. It's been there a long, long time. And absorb some of the courage that has gone into that continual existence of life. Now just take 3 more deep but gentle breaths. Kind of core of the earth, deep breaths, but not forced. And when you're ready, you may gently open your eyes again. Okay. All right, we've got this. So one last note. Not a trigger warning, but a spoiler alert. I really wrestled with just how much to talk about the central mystery of Twin Peaks, and ultimately the answer is kind of all of it. So if you haven't seen it in the past 30 years, I'm sorry. I will give a heads up when I'm really starting to talk about things. It'll all be in the second half that do give away some really important events and details of the show, and I completely understand if you'd rather preserve that, and if you needed to leave, or if you needed to plug your ears or whatever. I understand, but it just it needed to be there. Everyone's still here. Good. Okay. All right. So let's get into the ancient. Metamorphosis etymologically means transformation, to change shape. The Roman poet Ovid provides a kind of Rolodex of myths about change in his Metamorphoses from 8 CE, or what he calls his Book of Changes. And this is the primary source for these stories in my talk via this translation, which is very lovely, by Alan Mandelbaum. Ovid begins with an invocation of Proteus, the prophetic river god of many, many changes, and from whom we give the term Protean. The sort of cascading metamorphoses that fill his book are mostly transformations by passion, which is not always the same as love, we should note. Zeus, or Jupiter in this case, in the Roman mythos, transforms many a lover or enemy, but he's infamous for his self-transformations, the way he takes on different forms or disguises to seduce and facilitate rape. As a bull, he carries away Europa. To Leda, he comes as a swan. To Io as a cloud. Ganymede, an eagle. Danae as a shower of gold. So he might be the most prolific of these sort of divine rapists, the largest in size, scope, power, forms, but he is certainly not alone. As classicist Leo C. Curran writes, or Curran, I'm not sure of the pronunciation. Either way, it's not. It's a name. I'm not saying the Quran, the text. As he writes, in Rape and Rape Victims and the Metamorphoses, rape in this book is both a feature and a constant, as seen in multiple offhand allusions to rapes throughout the text. The famous Medusa, she is turned into a snake-haired monstrous after Minerva, who we know in the Greek as Athena, after she's offended that Medusa is raped by Poseidon in her temple. That's what changes her, that sort of sin. This story barely comprises 2 whole lines in the Metamorphoses, even though it's such a famous story to us. And it's not because it's not a good story or because Ovid's insensitive to it, but because it's just not uncommon. It's not an uncommon story. Rape is a convenient way to identify characters, or as Quran says, this is X, the one who was raped by Y. In ancient Greece, women had little power and could not report their rapes directly. Only their domestic male guardians, their fathers or husbands, could legally bring a claim to court. And when they did, it was usually to seek justice for their own good name. Restitutions were paid to them. Rape was, of course, popular in ancient Rome as well. The legend of Rome's founding is founded in rape. Romulus and Remus, the twin brother founders, were children of rape. For much of the Roman Republic's history, women were treated primarily as property of their fathers and husbands, with fathers having exclusive rights of possession over any children born of marriage. Women prostitutes were considered to have surrendered their rights to not be sexually or otherwise violently abused, and I think we're familiar still with that unfortunate opinion today. So of the approximately 250 myths in the Metamorphoses, about 50 are stories of rape. This, incidentally, is not far off from actual present-day statistics of rape in the US, according to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. Roughly 20% of women, according to these statistics, in this country have experienced either attempted or completed rape. Over 80% of women and 40% of men in the US have experienced sexual assault in some form. And numbers, as we know, skew higher for members of the LGBTQ communities and for people of color. And these numbers are reported incidents, so we can imagine what the real numbers might be. In 2012, the US Justice Department updated its definition of rape, and I learned this making this presentation, but this happened 10 years ago, and hopefully it'll be around for 10 more years. The penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. So meaning that one can be raped by any gender, and meaning that one doesn't have to determine if what they experienced was enough to be rape in the way we've had to in the past. And again, the timeline's pretty blurry between today's world and the ancient world. So because there are so many references to rape in these ancient mythologies, the question is often raised, maybe surreptitiously, is it really rape that these writers meant, or is it a coarse way of saying sex? And I'm not 100% sure, because I do not speak Greek or Latin, unfortunately, but I think we can follow a few clues to determine how to view these stories. Our English word rape derives from the Latin rapio, as do related terms such as rapt, rapture, raptor. Rapio means to snatch, carry away, or abduct, like a claws of a bird. So even when there's no literally genitally penetrative assault, the word rape as we know it nevertheless contains this sense of abduction, of taking by force, of carrying away. And this is key in the myths that I'm now going to tell you, because it's very evident, at least in the translations, that the female characters involved are trying to escape. They're pursuers. It's not consensual. Ovid is sympathetic to the fear and suffering of these women. His focus is on their emotional experience and their attempts to run away. Most of the mythic figures raped are maidens and nymphs. Nymphs are female godlings who preside over flowing fresh waters like springs, streams, and fountains. So they are literally and figuratively running waters. Among the most well-known myths of the Metamorphoses is the story of Apollo and Daphne from the first book. Apollo is the shining god of reason, measure, clarity, archery, and he mocks Cupid's audacity to propose that this little cherub baby can possibly aim an arrow as well as him, mighty Apollo. So obviously and naively, Apollo accepts this challenge. Cupid takes one arrow, this one is glittering and poisoned with passionate love, and he strikes Apollo. He takes another, this arrow is leaden, blunt, laden with passionate rejection, and he strikes Daphne. Daphne is a young virgin who emulates Diana, the never-wed goddess of the moon and the hunt. We know her as Artemis in the Greek myth, and she is Apollo's twin. So the arrows pierce their bone marrow, and Daphne is now Apollo's prey. She's chased and hunted, as many are in the Metamorphoses. He's driven by desire, and she is quickened by fear. Daphne is able to outpace him for a while, and then feeling Apollo's breath on her neck, knowing she'll be caught, she calls out to her father, who is a river god inhabiting a stream nearby. And this is how Ovid tells it. She cries, "Help me, dear father. If the river gods have any power, then transform, dissolve my gracious shape, the form that pleased too well." As soon as she is finished with her prayer, a heavy numbness grips her limbs, thin bark begins to gird her tender frame, her hair is changed to leaves, her arms to boughs, her feet, so keen to race before, are now held fast by sluggish roots. The girl's head vanishes, becoming a treetop. All that is left of Daphne is her radiance. So she's become a laurel tree. No more a carefree girl climbing trees, but now rooted as tree. But Apollo still won't quite let her be. And this is Ovid again. He leans against the trunk. He feels the heart that beats beneath the new-made bark. Within his arms, he clasps the branches as if they were human limbs, and his lips kiss the wood, but still it shrinks from his embrace. So she's still resisting. If he cannot possess her human body, he'll still have her as he can. So he says he will wear her leaves, her bay laurel leaves, in his hair, as will future champions of sport and poetry. He says, and even as my head is ever young and my hair ever long, may you, unshorn, wear your leaves too forever. And this is in reference to the evergreen of the laurel, which is a kind of perpetual immortality and virginity now for her, but it's also a curse, a permanent alteration. Ovid writes, Apollo's words were done. With new-made bows, the laurel nodded, and she shook her crown as if her head had meant to show consent. And I think that as if of the translation is very important. These laurel leaves are also the same leaves that were chewed by priestesses of Delphi when they wanted to induce their prophetic trances. Delphi was presided over by Apollo and Dionysius in part. It originally belonged to the earth. And these leaves were said to be impervious to flame because they don't burn easily, they crackle. So in other words, they demonstrate this kind of hissing resistance to being consumed, which I think all of the physical properties of the things and the poetry are so entwined. So there are more stories like this, if not so fully detailed. Demeter changes herself into a mare to flee the rape of Poseidon. Medusa, again, whose beautiful flowing hair is turned into writhing vipers. Medusa, whose gaze thereafter turns anyone to stone, which I mean any rape victim, I think, from there on out, is going to cast a bit of a stone-making gaze on future onlookers. So here we can also begin to sort of look at rapes of myth in a different sense. Rapes of myth. Myths of rape. Meaning the lies that are perpetuated about rape. And that's not, I'm not talking about when people lie about being raped. That's something that inevitably is a factor and a statistic as well, and a tragedy as well. But it's definitely the minority of cases. Because it's just not worth it to assume that sort of mark. And we can take Medusa, for instance, again. In her myth, rape is treated not only as her fault, but also her punishment, her burden to bear. And there are a few myths like this. Io is turned into a cow after her rape. She's forced by Juno, who is the goddess of marriage, Jupiter's wife, and therefore also a goddess of jealousy because Jupiter has so much infidelity going on. This is him coming to her as a cloud. And then this is a detail of a bigger painting of her sort of walking away. So yes, she is sort of reduced to this life now of humiliation and indignity, and she's watched constantly by this many-eyed figure Argus, as Quran says, like a woman in a small town who must endure the stares of all in their knowledge that she has been raped. And not only is she publicly humiliated, but she's also terrified and confused by her own appearance. Her own reflection causes her to run from herself, so it's being turned inward as well. And she can no longer communicate. She has no more human voice, and her family don't recognize her, which drives her mad. Who is she now? What has she become? Nobody wants to know her. So this is a myth about a girl turned into a cow, but it's also how things really do tend to go sometimes. The young Callisto, another devotee of Diana, is raped by Jupiter, and in this case, he disguises himself as Diana, as the deity that Callisto loves and trusts. He comes to her in the form of her god. So this is a case of abuse by or in the domain of one's faith, which we also know happens. And then she's also abandoned by her faith for it. She becomes pregnant, and this is something that the virgin cult of Diana can't abide. So Juno, like Diana, is a goddess not just of jealousy, but a goddess who is prayed to in childbirth to relieve birthing women of excess pain. So she has at least some associations with mercy in these conditions. But in this case, after Callisto gives birth, Juno turns her into a bear who is later hunted by her older, unwitting son. So most of the rape victims in the Metamorphoses are these young girls, virgins. And as we know, that younger females are also at significantly higher risk of complication in childbirth than older women, who also face plenty of risk already. So Karan writes, "It is against this grim background of medical helplessness, in which intercourse, pregnancy, and childbirth mean potential destruction for the women, that the poet sets his band of lighthearted rapists." To put things in mythic terms, I would say we have a real Jupiter, or Juno, Jupiter stacked Congress and court today. So we often hear about this wondrous timelessness of myth, and this is a version of that too. It's the darker version of it. It's really endlessly mind-blowing just how common it is for sexual assault victims or survivors, people prefer different terms, to bear the resentment of their families and their communities, for protection to be extended to perpetrators instead and to the complicit. And it's like there's just too much underworld on you now for the day world to deal with. So the easier thing to do is to deny or to bury it. The first person to admit to this sort of crime is not usually the perpetrator. Usually it's no one at all because of the shame attached to it, I imagine for perpetrators as well. But I wonder how many sexual assault survivors, upon finally entrusting someone with their story, have been greeted firstly with the question, well, did you want him to do it? Or what were you wearing? Or were you drunk? You know, what did you do that invited this upon you? What did you do that caused them to lose control? And one thing that Ovid's very old poem shows us repeatedly is that seductive and sexually active nymphs can be raped too. So we don't want to talk or hear about it, and we don't want to acknowledge just how many parts of the body are taken in sexual assault. It's not just the sex organs, it's the voice too. The voice is abducted too, like Io. And the most haunting myth in the book in this regard is Philomela. She's a teenage girl whose sister's husband abducts and rapes her, and to top it off, he cuts her tongue out to keep her quiet. So in this case, her sister does ally with her, and the two plot this very horrific revenge of murdering the rapist's son and feeding him to the guy. So, and Philomela is thereafter turned into a nightingale, a bird whose song feels kind of urgent. It's described as having a sense of urgency, and which is the name of one of Badalamenti's songs for the Twin Peaks soundtrack. So why is there so much rape from the gods? Even the nymphs sometimes rape. Why is rape a divine motif? Because it's a recurring human experience, for one, of course. And because sexual assault is frequently perpetrated by an entity that's perceived as most powerful, as more powerful than the victim, above the law of the land. Divine rape is a metaphorical picture of rape done not only by gods, but by parents, partners, police, politicians, celebrities. There's such a pandemic of rapes from Olympus that when the young mortal Arachne challenges Minerva to a weaving contest, she weaves basically a catalog of the gods' rapes and how many forms they take on to do so. It's sort of a bestiality of disguises. Simply presenting this image inflicts Arachne with so much shame that she hangs herself, but Minerva won't let her off that easy. She transforms Arachne into a spider, always in some way now hanging from a thread, bound to the medium of her artistic expression, which is now her actual survival mechanism. And that's sort of a deeper theme that I'm trying to draw forth in this presentation. Here's this horror show from the Dore etchings from Dante's Inferno. I hate it. But that's why it's good. Minerva is a virgin goddess herself, and sometimes she bestows mercy. She bestows these merciful metamorphoses on girls in crisis as well. The gods are amoral or transmoral. They're not ever fully just good or bad. So these two episodes will more or less close this, I know, really brutal look into the Book of Changes. The first is the beautiful princess Cornix. who is spotted by Neptune, Poseidon, as she walks along the seashore. He lamely attempts to seduce her, but Cornix does not heed, and so, as she tells it through Ovid, he made ready to use force. He chased me. As I ran, I left behind the hard-packed sands and staggered wearily along the soft and yielding shore, in vain. Then I invoked both the gods and men. My voice could reach no mortal. But a virgin, I did stir the virgin goddess with my plea. As I stretched my arms out toward the sky, they started to grow darker, sprouting feathers. Oops. They started to grow darker, sprouting feathers. I tried to free my shoulder, flinging off my robe, but it too had become a cloak. I am trying to figure out how to see the rest of this long quote. Here we go, because it is very good. Okay. I tried to free my shoulder, flinging off my robe, but it too had become a cloak of feathers, rooted deeply in my skin. I tried to beat my bared breast with my hands, but I, by now, had neither hands nor breast. I ran, but now my feet no longer sank into the sands. I skimmed along the ground. Then I flew off on high into the sky. I was taken by Minerva as her stainless, blameless comrade. So she becomes a crow. As often happens in the Metamorphoses, one myth will then tell another myth. And so that's what happens here. And Cornix, after recounting her own story, she then tells the story of another young girl, and she does tell it with a bit of jealousy and victim blaming, which is a hard fact. This other girl who supplanted her in Minerva's favor, named Nyctimene. Nyctimene is known throughout Lesbos for an outrageous sin, Cornix says, namely the crime of being raped by her own father. Deeply ashamed, she wishes never to venture into daylight again. And Cornix says, she flees men's eyes and flees the light. She hides for shame among the shadows. She has been cast out by all and exiled from the sky. So she has become an owl. So these are transformations in extremis, in acts of self-protection and divine intervention sometimes, either way. The gods can choose their changes, but the mortals beg or suffer them. So now to sort of zoom out, give us some terminology by which to understand these things by. First and foremost, myth. Myth derives from the Greek muthos, which indicates an opening of the mouth, as in to tell a story, which is what we most know myth for. But I don't feel that muthos is maybe firstly or at least foremost about telling stories. Something happens that asks a story to be told about it. So myth or muthos, as I tend to sort of focus on it, is also about being affected by the mythic, affected by the big experiences of life, including the big stories. It's that instinctual response, that gasp of wonder, when the power of an event makes its mark on our being. James Hillman writes, only in mythology does pathology receive an adequate mirror, since myths speak with the same distorted, fantastic language. They appreciate the exceptional, outlandish, more than human dimension of souls in extremis. So this gasp of awe that writes what I like to call the erogenous zones of our internal mythologies, this, as Hillman also taught me, is an aesthetic response. In his essay, Thought of the Heart, he gave me a word that finally named what just so fascinates me about life and underscores my interest in myth, and that is aesthesis. Some of my dear students have heard a bit of this already. So I'm very aware, aesthesis is our root of aesthetics, and I'm very, very aware that aesthetics is not a word that inspires a lot of affection. It's a very dry, snobbish word as we know it, especially right after these deep, deep myths. We mostly know it as a surface level evaluation of style or taste or beauty, but its root, aesthesis, means simply but really powerfully to sense and perceive, to perceive with our senses and our instinct more than our rational intellect. And it also indicates to breathe or gasp in. It's that aha moment in which we immediately sense profound meaning and transformation is going on before we rationally comprehend or narrate it. So everything concrete and imaginal has an aesthetic element. It's a manner and quality of appearing, a texture, sensory detail. So it's already a really wildly informing part of our daily experience, our psychology, our mythologies. Aesthesis then is sort of like the peak experience of aesthetic dimension. And it's generated as much by beauty as it is by terror. Both things get our hearts pounding, leaping. It's inspired as much by bliss as by the pathological events of our lives that are haunted with detail, that we don't just live through, but that we survive, and that we struggle to remember without viscerally perceiving, sensing it all over again. So if we're seeking a mythic image to understand aesthesis through, we'd need a peak experience kind of God. As some of you know, I've proposed the Dionysian mythos to do this, but I've already talked about that on this stage. So I'm not going to go into him very much now. I will just say that aesthetics and the Dionysian concern what move us, what really turn us on and turn our heads. He's the god of many metamorphoses and forms, eroticism, intoxication, wine, noisy music, the senses, strangeness, liberation, dismantling oppressive structures, continual cycle and drama of death and life. He's also the god of ecstasy or ecstasis, which means to stand apart, to be displaced or transported out of one's mind or really more one's normal self in some way, including the mad ways. He's the god of madness and frenzy too. Or of escaping and allying with other things. He does a lot of that in his own mythos in order to survive. But I made a Dionysian move and I cut a bunch of stuff out because, for time's sake, but also because I think what he has going on comes through these other myths that I'm talking about, and I don't want his lightning to sort of steal the thunder of these more feminine mythologies. Even though he's a divine effeminate, he's primarily a god of women and for women. He doesn't really continue to exist without participation of women in his cult. The women had unusual power. The maenads depicted here, his ecstatic devotees become the god. Their shout of his name or his epithets was considered an epiphany of the god. And their role was to awaken his archetypal energies. So there, as this beautiful quote from Nor Hall captures, I think, very well, they're sort of the lightning rods. They're the transformers. Suddenly is this refrain of the Homeric hymn to Dionysus. Suddenly, life events, happy events, and also the tragic sort that we're attending to here, they change us inside and out. They don't have to define us, but they do tend to rearrange us for a time. And a related word to this that I've sort of only recently come to understand and to bring into this conversation is crisis. Etymologically, again, crisis from the Greek crisis with a K means the turning point in a disease towards either recovery or death. Apart from this medical implication, crisis more broadly means the vitally important or decisive state of things, the point at which change must come for better or worse. So it's an awareness that this is a decisive, pivotal moment, and it's decisive in that it begs for judgment. How are we going to respond? So in framing our instinct and our means to survive trauma and crisis as aesthetic, it simply focuses us on the way, the style, the texture, the feeling of how that instinct takes care of itself. What form does our survival take? Do we fight, flight, flee? A few other options a therapist recently shared with me are freeze, faint, and funny. As in, do we weirdly laugh or smile through recounting trauma? I do. And I would add these other F terms of fashion and fusion, maybe, to name how we cope with trauma sometimes by a type of dissociation that doesn't netherworld us out of it entirely, but rather associates our being with other things, with other forms, shapes, images. Extreme crises really can cast us in other forms that display or even disguise our existential condition. So, for instance, from the imaginal aesthetic dimension, ever since I was 6 years old, I will, on certain occasions, probably trauma triggers I can't identify yet, I will sort of ecstatically, in a way, go elsewhere to this place. I'm still here, but I'm also there. And the place is this glowing red room, and in the middle of it is a giant, strange white object, kind of like a big, smooth tooth. And it smells like stale cigarettes. I can feel it, I can hear it, I can smell it, all of it. I can do it now. And this just happens. And I'm not exactly sure why. An example from the concrete aesthetic dimension, in the wake of trauma, we might change our dress, the way we do our makeup. Physically, our face falls or lift, our body expands or atrophies. There's an interchange that's mimetically manifesting outwardly, where it first came from anyway. I came of age in the 90s, and I can tell you that after my own sexual trauma, becoming goth was really essentially becoming owl. It was night mode, external display of the night mode inside, the night flight. So pathological experience is among the most aesthetically affected we ever are. Hillman even contends that the basic translation of pathos is being moved, or the capacity to be moved. So staggered, even to the point of psychological dismemberment. And I want to be recognizing that, but also honoring that, I think, the forms that have been such an intimate part of our life experience. And in the process of remembering that follows, we might find ourselves grafted with things that we were not comprised of before. Trees, tree limbs, bird wings. This can include concrete and imaginal, as I said, images, as well as fictional, mythic, or cinematic aesthetic objects who become like avatars or auguries of our traumas and escapes. So I'm not saying we should stay fused with these things or that it's always a healthy thing to do. Sometimes, this sort of identification, necessary or meaningful as it might be, can also take forms of paranoid projection or even just straight consumerism. I just want to sort of recognize the phenomenon and explore it and honor its positives. And focus on the sorts of object relations that are founded in metamorphosis of crisis response. So this is something, I think we understand it, right? But I'm sort of making it up and trying to find terminology. But there are related psychological concepts and terminologies we can sort of bounce it off of. One is D.W. Winnicott's notion of the transitional object, which you may know, which is a term for the object that children cling to as they move into new developmental situations that cause anxiety. A stuffed animal or a blanket that helps provide familiarity and uncertainty. There's also a lesser known type of psychological, even psychotic object called the bizarre object. This was coined by psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion in 1957. The bizarre object is a violent projection of unwanted psychic elements onto things of the external world. This can turn the objects of perception into hostile presences, entwined with our memories and our senses. And his example is a gramophone that a disturbed patient feels is listening or watching to them. It becomes more of a taker than a giver, I guess. The object, he writes, angered by being engulfed in this trauma matrix, takes on extraordinary power, resulting in the patient now existing, quote, in a world of objects which are ordinarily the furniture of dreams. And let's see if I can figure out how to make the, nope, had a sweet animation. It is an animated GIF of the ceiling fan from Twin Peaks, but it's not happening. Okay. So I'm going to, from this sort of bizarre object world of which Twin Peaks has aplenty, including the ceiling fan that is up the stairs in the Palmer household, I'm going to start talking about Twin Peaks now, but the real spoilers won't come for a few more minutes. So Laura is like the show's axis anima mundi figure. Wait. Oh, yes. Who's effectively turned into an object herself in some ways, not entirely, but certainly significantly, as rape victims often are. But I want to transition with this quote, which I think forms a really nice bridge from the ancient into our final fold of this presentation. Transformation into the non-human is uniquely appropriate in the case of rape, for the process of dehumanization begins long before any subsequent metamorphosis of the woman's body, its onset being simultaneous with the decision to commit rape. The identification of rape and dehumanization is intimate and virtually immediate in Daphne, where the heroine begins to lose her humanity as soon as the chase begins. As Daphne runs from Apollo, the effect of the wind on her fluttering clothing and streaming hair corresponds closely to what the wind will do to the branches and leaves of the tree she is to become. So the first time I came to this auditorium, it was to attend a panel on Twin Peaks: The Return, which was just starting its third series, its series continuation in spring, Persephone season of 2017. My first graduate work, my first work at all on myth, was about Persephone and Laura. I've branched out mythically from Persephone tonight. She's a more familiar myth. She was abducted by Hades, raped by Hades, kept in the underworld for a time until there was a deal was struck to allow her to return to the upper world for part of the year, the spring, bring the flowers, to be with her mother again. But she always had to return, and she becomes queen of the underworld. In a way, she's always there. Whenever souls go there, she's there. And she's partially there because she ate food in the underworld. She was given pomegranate seeds by Hades, and she ate them, and that's given as the reason. She's like metabolized what she's gone through. So just that quick background I want to acknowledge. But Twin Peaks functions mythically in lots of classic ways beyond particular mythic associations. It has a broad pantheon. It has strange creatures, incest, irreducible mystery, a really wide range of emotion, and a necessity of interpretation, as well as many, many returns and repeated motifs. It has a hell of a metabolism for metamorphosis, of forms that give way to other forms, doppelgangers, generational sagas, shared names, or multiple names that work like the epithets of gods that sort of capture the archetypal stemming of characters. So like the man from another place, who is him, who is also the arm, who is also Mike, this character Mike's arm at one point, who then in the return is the evolution of the arm, and who might be also an image of Laura's beating heart, or maybe the red in the traffic light that's so iconic in Twin Peaks. You can make these sort of associations. David Titterington, in a piece called Twin Peaks and Vomit, Where Pies Go When They Die, writes, and I have this in a later slide kind of by accident, but you'll be able to see it there. Twin Peaks is not a linear code, but is more like a myth that works through a system of correspondences. I think that's well said. So there are many, many one and the sames, forms that flow into one another. Black coffee, scorched motor oil, gramophone hole. I read this Diane Arbus quote the other day in which she says, "Nothing is ever the same as they said it was. It's what I've never seen before that I recognize." I feel like that's what I feel when I watch this show. And myth and art are really all about seeing the real in the unreal, and vice versa. And something I enjoy about the return is that it reminds us how this evolution, this sort of epigenetic inheritance and energetic transference of beings and traumas and quirks even also happens simply in the aging process, by which we're always the same but different, changing shape and style. So an example here would be Jerry Horn. In the original series, he had this lust for Parisian artisanal breads. Now he's changed a bit. He's got this easy love of AK-47 infused baked goods, and his look reflects that. So Twin Peaks is a very, very aesthetically occupied art form and mythos. It's something we know the show and Lynch's work for. They're Lynchian, and then our odd hometown, events become Lynchian too. They're like Twin Peaks. This aesthetic also sort of unfolds in the material fetishization and materialization of souvenirs and objects, things that sort of lean into the kitsch of the show and serve as little flares to fellow initiates. The look and sound of everything deeply matter. It's a much more aesthetically or correspondence-driven show than plot-driven, or I'd say these work together, kind of libidinally. They make a place. They make a world opened, which phenomenologist Mikel Defren says is the real measure of aesthetic experience. Does it open a world? Lynch follows the images that come to him intuitively. The Red Room apparently came to him fully formed as he leaned on a hot car one day. And Twin Peaks would not be so immersive, it might not even work without the haunting music of Angelo Badalamenti. It took the music to bring the story sort of really into sort of its form for Lynch. And I imagine some of you have seen this video, but I included it given his passing and because it so wonderfully captures this and will lift the spirit a bit. So Matthew, ready? Takes just a moment.
This is the keyboard that all the major themes were created for Twin Peaks. It's an old Fender Rhodes and kind of beat up. And David would sit right over here, right to the right of me, and we would put a little cassette just about over here on this keyboard, just keep it in record and just keep it playing. David would sit here and I'd say, well, what do you see, David? What is, just talk to me. And David would say, okay, Angelo, we're in a dark woods now, and there's a soft wind blowing through some sycamore trees, and there's a moon out, and there's some animal sounds in the background, and you can hear the hoot of an owl, and you're in the dark woods. Just get me into that beautiful darkness with the soft wind. And I started playing. And David would say, Angelo, that's great. I love that. That's a good mood. But can you play it slower? And I'd say, slower, David? Okay. And I'd go. He says, that's it. That's a good tempo. Just keep it going slow like that. Just keep that going for a while. And in David's mind, you can just see that he was visualizing the description that he envisioned. Then he would say, okay, Angelo, now we got to make a change, because from behind a tree in the back of the woods, there's this very lonely girl. Her name is Laura Palmer, and it's very sad, but get something that matches her. And I just segued into this. And he'd say, well, that's it. It's very beautiful. I could see her. and she's walking towards the camera, and she's coming closer. Just keep building it. Just keep building it. And she's getting close. Now reach some kind of climax. And I would go, and he said, oh, that's it. Oh, that's so beautiful. Angelo, oh, that's tearing my heart out. I love that. Just keep that going. Now, she's starting to leave. So fall down. Keep falling. Keep falling. Keep falling. Now go back into the dark woods. That's it. Keep going. Just keep it going. Very quiet and mysterious. David got up, he gave me a big hug. He said, Angelo, that's Twin Peaks. I said, okay, David, I'll go home and I'll work on it. He said, Angelo, don't do a thing and don't change a signal note. I see Twin Peaks. And that's how it was done.
So that's Laura's theme, too. Okay, so Lynch dwells, and so we get to dwell in these aesthetic details of humans and non-human life forms and the relationships between them. There's the log lady, of course. There's cherry pie. There's the stoplight at Sparkwood. And 21, cotton balls. The ready-made surrealist object, fish in the percolator. The show's givens are the waterfall and the illuminated gas, or fire. Its iconic opening credits are a dreamy ode to the banal, and all of these sensory material affairs exist right alongside the supernatural. In this mythos, suffering has the texture of creamed corn. A staircase it acts in effect like a Jacob's ladder to hell. The wind in the trees is like a whirlwind in the thorn tree. And the spin of a record player or ceiling fan is a harbinger of rape, violence, and dissociation and/or ecstasis. So the supernatural as supernatural, as scholar of religion and the paranormal Jeff Kripal emphasizes it, this entwinement of material and immaterial, the necessity of the senses and dreams and weirdo intuitions to the detective's journey, the way things both are and are not what they seem, big mysteries, quaint town, and the attunement of comedy and tragedy. It's equal parts campy soap as sheer terror. You can't make like, I've shown my students this fake trailer of The Shining that I'm sure a lot of people have seen, where it's framed as a comedy. It has comedy, has lighthearted music, and you can kind of see that, oh, with just the little adjustment, it's something different. You can't quite pull that off with Twin Peaks because it's doing both all the time. So anyway, all of these feelings still strike me as they did when I first watched the show on rented VHS in Baltimore, Video Americaine, years ago, and that is that this is the most realistic show I've ever seen. And this effect has a lot to do with Lynch and Badalamenti and Mark Frost, but I want to give the rest of the shine to Cheryl Lee, who plays Laura Palmer, the most dead alive girl I know. This is where the spoilers actually happen, so just, you've been told. So the heart of the show is Laura, and we meet her straight away as murdered. She's washed up on the riverbank, and the central trauma is not just that she's killed, but as we learn quite a bit later, after much seeking and finding, and strange ways of coming at clues and evidence, she was killed by her father, and she had been being raped by him for many years before that. And that her mother, Sarah, sometimes could not and sometimes did not intervene. So all three of these characters are shapeshifters in their own way, father, mother, daughter. They blend into or carry other forms to navigate this dark reality. Aesthetic survival is not just for, the innocent fleeing something terrible. All things need to take on some form to survive, whatever they're trying to carry forward. In her secret diary, which was published, it was written by Lynch's daughter, actually, Jennifer Lynch. Laura writes about her double existence as the two Lauras, the sweet, charitable homecoming queen and the desirous, even manipulative, self-objectifying sex worker who's straining against possession by the same demonic violence that drives her father. And many men in Twin Peaks fall in love with this split or try to pry into that split. Laura is wrapped in plastic. That's our first description, an image of her. And in this, we can also read that she molds. She's plastic. She morphs. Her arms bend back. And we see her image change in this hypnotic ceiling fan gif that should be playing there, yeah. Her face changes from a daze into this fierce and kind of knowing smile, and that's where I hear that Misfits song. Leland is possessed by an evil spirit named Bob. Whether or not this is true or it's a delusion created by Leland or Laura to prevent consciousness of the actual matter is an intriguing question, but it's really a bargain of equally disturbing solutions. As Agent Cooper says, is it any easier to believe that a father would rape and murder his daughter? So the face of Bob is only seeable by the gifted and the damned. When he leaves Leland's body, eventually he moves into the body of an owl. The owls are not what they seem. And we learn later on that Bob's creation myth is that he was born, in effect, from the first detonation of the nuclear bomb. There's not too much more about it. I just want to let you know that. The experiment, let's see. There's also this character of Judy. Judy's a powerful, negative, ambiguous force that feeds on suffering, and it's suspected that it's this demon who possesses Sarah, the great negator, repressor of the household, and whose middle name is Judy. This figure, this experiment that's released with the nuclear explosion is also associated with Judy. It's hard to keep these things clean, but in any case, a translation of Judy means called out or screamed. Sarah's quite a scream queen as well. And there are other images and language that sort of evoke her dissociative tendencies to drug herself, to be drugged against her will sometimes, and also just straight denial. Grace Zabriskie, who plays Sarah really searingly, reflects on her character saying, quote, "There's almost a Greek thing going on here. There's her fate and therefore Laura's fate." And we eventually learn that Leland and Sarah suffered abuse as children themselves. Bob is the face that abused young Leland. And so it's this round and round kind of spin cycle ceiling fan of abuse that Laura means to end by letting herself be killed rather than allowing Bob to fully possess her and extract more suffering through her. So she resists both Leland, Bob, and Sarah Judy, whose form is similarly kind of creeping into her with her increasing need for dissociative substances. And I just wanted to correlate this to another form that trauma can take, which is a very gravitational pull to resist, which is for the traumatized or in crisis person to kind of become a sleeper, to fade out, to pull away, go under somehow to avoid reality. And it's a form of protection that hauntingly takes on the same form that is often the opportunity for an abuser to come in sleep, come in the night while the victim is asleep. And the first aesthetic defense is often pretend you're asleep, pretend to stay asleep, become a statue of a sleeper, dead-like, which over time can make you go to sleep psychologically or become kind of permanently cocooned like Sarah. But an empathetic and hopeful mythic figure for this condition is Ariadne. She's the one who gives Theseus the thread to wind his way through the labyrinth and back after slaying her hybrid brother, the Minotaur. And upon his success, he vows to marry her, to sail away from Crete and back to Athens. But on their stopover at the island of Naxos, she falls asleep on the beach and he sails on without her. And maybe he meant to abandon her, or maybe he forgot her, or maybe there's something that drives her to sleep, pretend to be asleep, and he'll go away. But in any case, it's in this sort of state of dissociation or lament that her destined partner, Dionysus, arrives, aka life force returns to her, and she ascends in epiphany. Her name means the utterly clear. So Hillman thought that aesthesis, involuntary as it might be, nevertheless cannot be taken for granted. It's an attraction to life. It's the stakes of being a life form and a life force that, if need be, needs to be provoked or even outraged. The enemy of the aesthetic reflex is indifference. It's the anesthetic. So the single most important takeaway I got from studying Dionysus and aesthesis is that in that mythic set, repression is no longer an option. Expression is going to happen one way or another. So to be engaged in sensing and perceiving and expressing your inner and outer worlds as they are happening is not just a superficial interest, but a survivalist skill. Going still is a form of aesthetic survival, but it's just not a way to keep living or to keep others living. So it's this kind of dissociative myths of violence and silence that are what Laura commits to breaking in the Twin Peaks prequel, Fire Walk with Me. The most difficult scene, I think, is not when we see Bob's face, even though he's supremely creepy, but when we see that Leland's face. He's the man kind of behind the Bob mask, and once Laura knows this or lets herself see this, the end is near. And if you know the myth of Dionysus' mother, Semele, seeing Zeus in his godly form and being incinerated, it reminds me of that. So Laura has this painting in her bedroom that brings her a childish comfort of 3 children being served food by an angel. The 3 children maybe correspond to her nuclear family. And the morning after she sees Leland, this angel disappears. Laura's final diary entry reads, "I'm so afraid of death. I'm so afraid that no one will believe me until after I have taken the seat that I fear has been saved for me in the darkness. Please don't hate me. I never meant to see the small hills and the fire. I never meant to see him or let him in." And there it's disappeared. Sorry. So that night, Leland Bob drives Laura and another girl, Ronette Pulaski, to an abandoned train car and further brutalizes them. Before Ronette manages to escape, not unscathed, she sees an angel floating above her in the image of Laura, very similar to Laura. With some supernatural assistance, Laura prevents Bob from entering her, but for this, she is killed. Laura's soul, let's say, now finds herself in the Red Room with Detective Dale Cooper, who will investigate her murder. And the film ends with this really heartbreaking, heart-melting scene of an angel appearing and Laura's face changing again, but this time to a tearful but relieved smile. So this is the image of metamorphosis in crisis and survival that I want to conclude with. For a significant number of female survivor viewers of Twin Peaks, Laura is an image we see ourselves in, that we become, who accounts for the complexity of our stories and personalities, the terror of sexual abuse, especially in a childhood home, and the toothsome resistance required to get through it, to trust your angels are there or will be there again. So Laura is a guardian angel, and she gives us that kind of great angelic range from the kind of many-eyed grotesque of old Bible stuff to the apotheosis of light and grace that welcomes Laura at the end of her life and lets her, I think, feel finally unafraid and also good. And it is important for me to say, on a personal note, that my own sympathies with Laura very fortunately do not involve my own father. I do not need that being suspected. But she has let me see and scream and speak what I did experience 25 years ago and do carry still, and she's done this for many others. So I want to just share with you these few testimonials from a book called Laura's Ghost, Women Speak About Twin Peaks, edited by Courtney Stallings. She created this book to give women voice about how Laura's ghost haunts and guards them. And the names are in the book. I just felt a bit odd doing that myself here. So Laura gave me acceptance of the dark and light sides of myself at a time when I needed understanding the most. Self-love is a weapon. Laura's light was the ultimate weapon against her descent into complete darkness. Her light transferred to all of us at a crucial age when we needed to know we weren't alone. Laura, thank you for haunting me. Thank you for being an angel to a girl you never met. Another. Her laughter, her cries, and her screams wash over me, under me, inside of me. She touches the places in me that have been injured and awakens them. I dissociate, but I'm enthralled at the same time. I'm present with Laura and aware of my stomach's emotional gut-wrenching. Cheryl Lee's performance rips out my heart and then puts it back in my chest. Her pain is specifically hers, but it is so many women's pain, of surviving the unspeakable. Suddenly, it's just me and Laura. One more. It was the first time I had ever seen anything like that put on screen. We didn't talk about rape. We didn't talk about partner abuse. In the 90s, we weren't talking about these issues openly. Twin Peaks was so cool because it gave us that face. I remember watching it with others, and quietly stories would come out. We would ask, "Why do you like Laura Palmer?" And someone would say, "My uncle," or "My first boyfriend raped me." For a lot of women, that is one of the biggest gifts that show gave us. We could talk about Laura as a character, and through Laura, we could talk about our own experiences and find solidarity among other women. It was like a light switch went on. The first switch went on when I saw the show. All the lights went on after Fire Walk with Me. Lynch cast a woman named Mary Reber, who is the current occupant of the location used as the Palmer House, as the occupant of the house in The Return, which Laura and Dale return to. It's a sort of Orpheus Eurydice moment that has split fans because it does in some way revoke some of the power Laura had in making her own decision about her fate in Fire Walk with Me. I'm not going to tell you all about it. At the same time, it also really displays how quickly our traumas can return, especially when we visit those places again, the places, the rooms, the haunted houses that are kind of the Olympics of aesthetic returns. But sometimes we must, by choice or by force. And even if we can't in our own lives, revisiting Laura's house has become a sacred pilgrimage for some, with Mary Reber apparently being an extremely gracious host. She writes, "People come in, and during the walkthrough, they'll start telling me about their trauma. As they walk in the door, they're leaning into their trauma. They're turning the corner. They're looking at that fan, and they start crying. It's people being able to lean into something that is hard, but it's therapeutic for them, too. They walk away, and they stand outside, and they look up to the house, and I just love it. I'm driven by that. Once they turn the corner and see Laura Palmer sitting on my table in that picture frame, they always grab her and say, 'Oh, Laura, it's timeless. Her picture is timeless because her story is timeless.'" And finally, of course, more than any other, people constantly share their stories with Cheryl Lee, who takes up Laura's proactive spirit when she describes Laura's legacy like this. "I do believe that if a person intervened, she would have made it. She wanted to make it. There was a survivor instinct in her. I always think of that angel at the end. For me, that was the peace that needed to happen. There needed to be peace. If anything, I would hope that the legacy is we can finally start talking about this so that we can do something about sexual abuse, incest, sex trafficking, all of it. I feel like with Laura, don't let it be for nothing. Laura's legacy is that we all need to take better care of each other." She emits this scream again in The Return that she says she was able to emit by thinking about this nightmare happening over again and how it is still happening, that there are still women who need to scream who are not allowed to scream. The statistics regarding violence against women are going up, not down. That was her scream. And then this wonderful quote about her: she's the best screamer in the world. God bless Cheryl Lee. She knows how to scream anybody awake. So, muthos, an opening of the mouth, as in from scream to speech, or to some medium that can exhale that trauma. To move from the aesthesis response of wide-eyed, wide-mouthed recognition or terror to a more willful aesthetic expression that is also, most of all, what our survival depends on. What form do we want to take? What can we take? So it'll come out one way or another. And the weapon of self-love, I think, is tending to that form of expression, striving to make it more creative than destructive. And I do want to say that you don't ever have to extract your most closely held secrets, verbally or otherwise. I think a really important, vital element in self-healing is agency in your own time, which is going to be later and sooner than others want, in your own way, to whomever and whatever you determine is safe and trustworthy. There's a difference between forced silence and a sacred secret. So I wanted to make sure to say that. For those of you who do not relate to Laura personally, she might help you relate to those who do, for whom Laura has opened up stories that never felt speakable before. That Juno court is putting a lot of young women in danger and a deeper call of silence. It's happening again. It's always happening again. Persephone always returns to Hades, is always partially in Hades, even after she is permitted to return to her mother on Earth each spring. But she takes on a rulership down there, like Laura. So the gift of underworld experiences like this is that you end up with eyes that are more attuned to the dark, that can see not just our kindred images and myths, but also our kindred people too, to empathize with the wrought changes and the protective forms, which may eventually give us strange abilities and capacities, to be a compassionate refuge for others who need the wisdom of the experiences we never wanted, but that we have. So, if once upon a time, to save ourselves, we became a tree, we might now be able to give a resting place to birds. If we were once upon a time turned into a bird, then maybe we can sing together. If we were once upon a time turned into spiders, then we can weave something beautiful, or even if need be, ensnaring with this damn thread. We'll be ghosts to some and angels to others. So I want to thank all my angels here present and elsewhere tonight. Thank you.